With the introduction of the Wii's unique motion sensing controls, Studio Cavia would return to create another rail shooter experience. Masachika Kawata would lead production for this game, along with the help of some Clover Studio developers. Kawata said that the Wii player base would find much more enjoyment from an easier gameplay experience, so the on-rails format was chosen for the game. Umbrella Chronicles was a bit more experimental and encompasses scenarios that were already covered in the previous games, but with a new gameplay format. It covers Resident Evil 0, Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil 3, and then introduces a new scenario with Jill and Chris infiltrating Umbrella's final stronghold in Russia, which is harboring their latest creation, Talos Project.
The latest in the Umbrella's product line.
Wesker also arrives on the scene to try and recover some important Umbrella information, all while defeating his nemesis, Sergei Vladimir. After that, the game finally shows Umbrella being exposed, and the US government succeeds in its legal action against them. Now this was pretty cool to see, because there was huge unanswered questions since Code Veronica came out in 2000, and RE4 came out in 2005, and the beginning of RE4 is like, oh, Umbrella is finished, and yeah, that was okay, like, how, what happened? Anyways, as for the gameplay itself, well, it's a rail shooter. Even though it's exactly what you expect, a rail shooter, it was received really well for its impressive and satisfying gameplay, as well as having plenty of fun content. It seems Cavia really succeeded in improving the motion sensor aspect they worked on before with Dead Aim, and the reception would warrant having expansion, the Dark Side Chronicles, which would release 2 years later, covers some other scenarios that weren't touched in Umbrella Chronicles. The origins of Leon and Krauser working together, a retelling of the events of RE2, a retelling of the events of Code Veronica, and a hidden scenario that explains Krauser's side of the Operation Javier story that you played in the first scenario. This is where you learn about his arm injury and his interest in the viruses to grant him his power back. Thus, he begins his search for Albert Wesker. This time, Kawata wanted to put more emphasis on the horror aspect, which led to the team working on a camera system that made you feel like you were kinda in the game a bit more. Realistic camera shaking and improved graphics would help with this a lot, and ultimately lead to a more satisfying experience. Headshots were made easier, the status screen was implemented, separate health bars, as well as heals and weapon customization. Overall, a big improvement, despite the reactions to the more realistic camera being a bit mixed. But Darkside Chronicles wasn't the big release for 2009. No. It was time to bring the big guns. Resident Evil 5, directed by Yasuhiro Onpo and Kenichi Ueda, would release 4 years after RE4, and was set up to release on the Xbox 360 and PS3. This game was huge, in multiple ways. With Jun Taikuchi being head of production, he and the team created a new story set in a completely new environment with quite a few redesigns. This includes the look of Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Albert Wesker, and a few key elements of the gameplay. The inventory menu was changed, and the merchant was replaced with sort of like a store, I guess you could say, that you could access between chapters. Some of the character redesigns were a bit of a stretch, but they were accompanied by something that makes the production of this game quite spectacular. It was the first game to use a virtual camera system. Ruben Langdon, Karen Dyer, and Ken Lally all did a great job with motion capture and brought a lot of life to the game. Big props to Karen for working long shifts, performing her own stunts daily to portray the absolutely awesome animations we see Sheva do every time we play the game. This, along with hardware improvements to make more detailed graphics, sets up RE5 to be the first game to mainly take place during the day. In Africa, which is actually a great environment to show all of this off. The idea behind the Ganados was carried over to introduce the Majini, who were much more aggressive and violent than the Ganados. With that said, this game takes another step up in action. It still uses the third-person aiming, the QTEs, the large enemy groups, the big mini-boss moments, the enemy drops. It really does carry pretty much everything over from RE4, and doesn't add a ton, but this time, it's not just one protagonist experiencing all of this. This game has co-op. That's right, you finally get to play the story mode of a mainline Resident Evil game with a friend at your side. Fight side by side, link sick QTE attacks, manage ammo and items together, and solve puzzles and situations together. Whether it's saving your partner from a trap or enemies, holding a door or a gate open for them, throwing Sheva over to a part of the area that would otherwise be inaccessible, you're always working together to get things done, and it works surprisingly well for a series that was mainly single player. The decision to have co-op included was made partway through development, and the initial response wasn't great. As time went on, the team realized that having co-op could open up possibilities for those edge-of-your-seat situations where one player is in serious danger and the other player must overcome the obstacles to save them. This is evident from how many parts of the game requires one player to take on the role of supporting the other, as they work on opening a gate, pushing various things blocking the way, and riding lifts or platforms to reach different parts of the area. With the large focus on the new environments, cooperative play, and action-packed gameplay, there are aspects of this game that do feel very disconnected. RE4 had a few sections that retained the spooky atmosphere and made you uneasy in the situation. RE5 doesn't really do that as much, and you never truly feel like the game is trying to scare you. It kind of feels like it's trying to surprise and shock you pretty often, but the scare factor definitely was limited. Despite that, further explanation of the post-RE4 plans that Wesker had, the new information on Tricell and Ouroboros, the return of Chris and Jill, and the end to the Wesker saga. It all still feels very much so like a Resident Evil game, and it's simply running along with the success of the evolution of the series. It was a huge success, and it's still the best-selling Resident Evil game to this very day. But now that the series is having such a huge boom of success with this new formula, where would this take the Resident Evil series in the future? Will it ever return to its survival horror roots? Or will it simply continue to be this new action-packed experience? After Resident Evil 5, Tosi was called back in to develop a spin-off for Nintendo 3DS based on a popular game mode from Resident Evil 4 and 5 called Mercenaries. I really don't have much to say about this. It's Mercenaries, with some quality of life mechanics added like moving while aiming and reloading and healing. Skill points are also a thing, so you can improve the various character abilities that were available. And these characters included Chris, Jill, Albert, Claire, Krauser, Barry, Rebecca, and Hunk. It's truly the first title to just embrace a completely arcadey formula based on some New Game Plus mode that you would unlock in the main games prior. Like I said, I don't have much to say about it, although it did feature a short playable demo of Revelations, which was set to release the next year. So let's get into that. Koshi Nakanishi was the director behind Revelations, and he was determined to bring a game to the 3DS that resembled more of what we saw before the evolution that occurred with Resident Evil 4 and 5. Keep the modernized gameplay while bringing back the survival horror atmosphere. The ship that the game took place on was a big part of this, as well as the sound design behind enemies. These two things were probably the most important in the attempt to bring back the horror feel. Jill walking through the eerie, tight corridors of the ship, hearing terrifying noises of the creatures that roam. Exploration and survival were more emphasized, as well as not providing as many resources as the previous titles. The limited resources were actually balanced out quite well with the ability to aim while moving, something that we did just see in the previous title of the 3D Mercenaries. All of this, along with the technical team's efforts to make the graphics the best they could be on the DS, I mean, this is one of the best horror experiences to ever make it on a portable console. A nice addition to the series, and a reminder that Resident Evil can still return to its roots. But this was only one of 3 Resident Evil games that would release in the year 2012. The next game? Well... Operation Raccoon City. Slant 6 Games, developer of multiple SOCOM US Navy SEALs games, was asked to create this game in what I think was an attempt to just further capitalize on the rising popularity of action-oriented multiplayer games. 12 playable characters were available, 6 for each side, the Umbrella Security Service and the US Special Ops team. This story follows both sides encountering the incidents that occurred in Raccoon City. It has a single-player mode, but also features a 4-player co-op mode that puts the two sides against each other. The return of the QTEs, a new taking cover system, really tanky enemies, and an emphasis on fast gunplay. You kinda get the point here. At least there was a returning mechanic from Outbreak, where when a player gets infected and runs out of time, they just end up attacking teammates. That's kinda cool. But if you don't already know, or can't tell, I don't like this game. It's not absolutely awful, but it's really unnecessary, and it's one of the only games in the series I just simply refuse to play anymore. So with that, let's move on to the most important release of 2012 for the Resident Evil franchise. Out of all of the mainline games, this one is the most divisive amongst the fanbase. Resident Evil 6 takes everything that Resident Evil 4 and 5 did so well, turns it up to 11, spreads it over 4 different stories, and succeeds at being the biggest project thus far. At the start of development, Yoshiaki Hirabayashi wanted to cut back the action a bit and balance things out for the survival horror enthusiasts who preferred the balance in titles like Resident Evil 4. However, the horror genre was changing a fair bit around this time, and that made higher-ups at Capcom believe that the Resident Evil series should continue to evolve further to avoid trying to cater to a niche audience that was seemingly dying out. Upon this decision, Hiroyuki Kobayashi was asked to deliver what would be the most impressive title in terms of production. Surely this is what led to Resident Evil 6 having so much content. Divided into different campaigns, and with so many different characters in each. Leon Kennedy, Chris Redfield, Ada Wong. Some of these characters you would only dream of having in the same game, but the way this turned out wasn't as dreamy as it sounded. Content was plentiful, and it was the longest Resident Evil game to complete thus far. But having so much content ended up causing the game to be kind of a jack of all trades, while failing to be truly amazing at anything. What I really mean by this is that it is introducing so many new mechanics and ideas, but not really excelling at any of them. Each campaign feels and plays differently, and aims to do so in a way that gives you varying experiences throughout the entire game. A lot of cookies going to a lot of different jars. It's nice to spread out, but to spread so thin is this game's weakness. I'll start with some of the obvious ones. Trying to continue the cover system that many games before it did better is a huge bummer, and on-rail sections are plentiful in this title, some of them involving driving and flying vehicles with very janky controls. Chris gets in a chase where you have to drive, you control VTOL in various spots, and you drive snowmobiles as Jake and Sherry. Jake drives a motorcycle, Ada flies a helicopter. Cool ideas, honestly, but it's all kind of janky, and not what you would necessarily be looking for when playing a Resident Evil title. Although, the Java are a new type of enemy that definitely leans towards being a good idea, more so than it does being a bad one. They adapt and work with each other in a way that we haven't seen much of in previous titles, along with the various mutations that can happen. It does make fighting a bit more interesting. But the combat. The issue with the combat is that it's go, 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 action, 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 and it is one repetitive roller coaster. Even more ammo and melee to take care of mobs, and now these mobs have a chance of dropping skill points. These are used to increase weapon effectiveness or drops. This is one of the things in this game that makes it feel a little bit more arcadey. QTEs return for many different encounters and attacks, and exceed the amount that RE4 or RE5 introduced. This isn't really a big deal, but more so something that can interrupt the flow of the game. Something that goes hand in hand with this faster pace that they've introduced is the stamina bar. This isn't the first time we've had a stamina bar in an action horror game, but this one is used mainly for something specifically called a quick shot, which allows the player to instantly headshot an enemy. Very cool, but kinda unnecessary. This game's gameplay is actually really great, especially for an action game, but that's kind of what it is now, really. The horror is almost completely gone, and it almost feels like this gameplay works more in a Mercenaries kind of mode than it does really for a Resident Evil story mode. Despite some of the poor execution, I have to admit that this game isn't as bad as I may have just made it sound. It's also co-op, and playing this with a friend actually is a really fun time. It's just simply the strangest take on any of the mainline games thus far, and has wildly varying reception from critics and fans because of it. I'm not going to spend so much time explaining how this game evolved the formula, because it's just so evident to anyone who's played it, as well as the fact that this is where it ends. Resident Evil 6's reception was considered by Capcom and the Resident Evil teams, despite selling so well, and this leads to the end of what I believe is the action era of the Resident Evil's mainline titles. Much like how Resident Evil 4 was an attempt to evolve the series, the Resident Evil team would have to, yet again, reform and depart from the action formula that began working with since Resident Evil 4. With that, we won't be seeing another mainline title for a while. 3 years later, the sequel to the well-received Revelations game releases. Revelations 2, an episodic game featuring the grand return of Claire Redfield and the debut of Barry Burton being a playable character. Other than Gaiden, I guess. Anyways, the Revelations team was back in action to create this sequel. Not as much really of a sequel, but it's Revelations 2. They were very aware of what the fans would like to see yet again. They wanted to see Claire return, and they wanted to see a more balanced action horror game where the horror isn't totally lost like in Resident Evil 6. Claire is back, but she's accompanied by Maura Burton, Barry Burton's daughter. They work for a biohazard prevention agency called TerraSave and are both kidnapped and brought to Sejm Island, or Sem Island. I forget how to pronounce that. Anyways, there they encounter the Afflicted, who are humanoids driven insane by torturous experiments. Pretty cool concept, and nothing too out of the box for the series. This game also aimed to tie into the mainline title story more so than the previous Revelations game. The writing for this game is superbly done, and involved a lot of inspiration from Czech novelist Franz Kafka. Themes, quotes, concepts, all of them in this game are based on things like family and relationships, a person's level of sanity, transformation and metamorphosis. These themes lead to a much more interesting experience throughout the game as the story unfolds before you. As for the gameplay, well, I mean, it's somewhat similar to what you would expect in the more action-oriented Resident Evil games, although this one does hold back on the action a bit, and goes as far as to leaving 2 of the 4 playable characters unable to fight as effectively, and resort to lesser powerful melee weapons, or used to search the area for items or to help solve objectives. It also allows co-op gameplay, so you can enjoy the experience with a friend, and that is always a huge plus, in my opinion. Overall well received, and not going out of its way to evolve too much. Simply trying to deliver an interesting, fun Resident Evil experience for the fanbase yet again. But unfortunately, the next project, and with good intentions in mind, doesn't exactly do the same thing. Umbrella Corps. Ugh. Umbrella Corps is very likely at the bottom of most people's list, as it's simply like taking Gears of War Horde mode and Resident Evil Mercenaries and just slapping them together and calling it a day. You use a cover system called Analog Cover, you make use of zombie jammers to hide your presence from enemies, and you also use the Jammer Buster against opponents to jam their jam, so that they can't jam. That's it. That is all that this game truly has to offer. It exists purely for the sake of appealing to an audience that wishes to just shoot undead stuff for a couple hours with absolutely nothing meaningful behind it. Which is why I'm just going to move on to something that is truly the next amazing game that everyone had waited so many years for. This is it. The return to the roots, and what many people define as Resident Evil. After what I assume was a very hefty bit of discussion between higher-ups and the teams being put in charge for the next mainline games, it was agreed upon that Resident Evil 7 would change the formula once again. Koshi Nakanishi was the director of this, and led a team of about 120 people? Not as big as Resident Evil 6, but wow, was this team effective. They were also influenced by a fair amount of Western-themed horror this time around, and even had a Western narrative designer for the first time, Richard Piercy? He wrote the Fear expansions, Perseus Mandate, and Extraction Point, which I guess kind of leads to this story being somewhat like Fear in a way, with the little girl trope and whatnot, and yeah, anyways. This time, first-person perspective would be used, and it allowed the developers to immerse the players in the new settings, and ease back into some of those survival horror aspects that were lost with the introduction of RE4. This also led to the opportunity to put the new RE engine into full effect, and allow the player to experience Resident Evil 7 in virtual reality. Which, by the way, RE engine means reach the moon. Some people may think it means Resident Evil engine, but no, that's not the case. I just wanted to clear that up real quick. So, you're Ethan Winters, a man with nothing but a fool's hope of finding his missing wife Mia in the middle of Dulvey, Louisiana, after receiving a suspicious message from her. Upon reaching the house Mia is supposedly at, you start to realize that it is somewhat abandoned, rotting, and holds a few freaky surprises. This is already such a wonderful introduction to the game, seeing as it's truly immersing you in what will continue to be the game's atmosphere, for the most part. Mia turns out to be imprisoned and seemingly afraid to have whoever else is at the house notice her leaving with Ethan. And then bam, you fight, she dies, but not really. And then... Welcome to the family, son. The real journey through the hellish new southern mansion begins, and the survival part of survival horror starts to show. Ammo conservation instantly becomes a priority, obsessing over scavenging every nook and cranny for equipment, and acquiring keys and various items to solve puzzles and unlock new parts of the house. The inventory boxes return and are scattered throughout the different parts of the property. Although this game does allow you to drop some items, they will not be left on the ground like games such as Resident Evil 0. You will dispose of them, so you gotta think wisely before you do that. Another thing that returns in this title is the ability to craft. Whether it's handgun ammo, burner fuel, grenade launcher ammo, or healing items, you can craft it all with the right combination of items. Which, by the way, this game's item list is pretty simple. Various ammo types, handgun ammo that is enhanced, psychostimulants that help you find items, lockpicks to open various boxes and chests, classic green herbs, and the first aid liquid bottle things. I just call it Jesus Juice. Anyways, you get the point. A bunch of items that are simple and easy to understand and allow you to play the game in a few different ways. Puzzles are fairly easy, but smart and enjoyable little concepts to smile at, as they really do resemble something you would see in an original Resident Evil title. Jack Baker, the father of the Baker family, follows you around for the beginning of the mansion section and acts much like how Mr. X or Nemesis would act, constantly looking for you and chasing you around until he loses sight of you or you simply take him out. Marguerite also acts like this after you're able to open the door to the backyard and enter the other house, or the greenhouse, or the bee house, or whatever you want to call it. Her design is absolutely sickening. Though, it brings me to the next point. This game is gross. I think it's one of the themes of the game, and it works well in pretty much every part where it does get gross. You can see a horror movie influence when you see the dismemberment and the body horror type of stuff going on. Definitely not for the faint of heart or for people who may get sick easy. When I kind of think of the Western horror influence in this, I think of movies like The Evil Dead, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Shining, and a bunch of movies. Just Western horror movies come to mind when I think of this game's scenes and its dialogue. The team may not be as influenced by movies like these as I may think, but I feel it's there. It's safe to say that the huge change of direction in the story and theme, while bringing back the classic survival horror mechanics, was welcomed by the fanbase at large. Even though I've been talking up this game quite a bit, I will say it has some major flaws, some of which are to do with the introduction of a new engine and aren't as avoidable, so I won't mention those. I do personally feel like this game's first half is a lot more enjoyable and powerful than the last half, which would be the boat and onward. The choice between Mia and Zoe doesn't change enough to seem like such an important decision either. The info dump in the mines is a bit much to take in all at once, and the mines themselves don't even feel like a full area. It doesn't really feel finished. I mean, you find the map when you've already finished everything in it. That's kind of weird. And after that, I mean, you've got a really strange ending boss sequence. Despite all of this, I do think it's an overall great game. While some fans are not a fan of the first-person perspective, I personally feel that it's an important change, much like how the over-the-shoulder camera change was so important with Resident Evil 4. With this title out, Capcom were back on the right track with the series, and mostly everyone was very happy with the changes. Once again, we can say that this is Resident Evil. But what if that old version of Resident Evil was brought back entirely? I mean, that would be pretty cool. Oh. Hold on. Good news. We do it! Shortly after the release of Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil 2 Remake was officially confirmed to be the next release. The second ever remake in the series since the first one in 2002. This announcement was huge. It didn't matter if you were a longtime fan or a fairly new fan. This was big stuff on the horizon. Yoshiaki Hirabayashi was back in action for this title, and he knew what he had to do. He took all of that reception that he got from Resident Evil 6 and worked with fellow producer Tsuyoshi Kanda to create the horror atmosphere that the fans would want to see in a remake of one of the most important original titles. With the new RE engine already being worked with for a few years, the team were able to create stunning visuals and effects for RE2 Remake. Leon, Claire, Ada, Marvin, Chief Irons, the Birkins, and Ben were all given amazing new looks and some slight redesigns to modernize them. New voice actors were also involved, as well as new scripts and interactions between the characters. I'm assuming the story was going to be rewritten right from the get-go, so none of that is surprising. These redesigns and new interactions were also for enemies as well. Various zombies in the game are given a nice variety of clothing and outfits, compared to zombies in the previous titles. Speaking of modernization, this game did not bring back the fixed camera angles, which made it harder for the team to recreate certain scenarios. Very smart enemy placements, room designs, and lighting effects were all needed to recreate the scary, claustrophobic type encounters. This also goes a long way with the atmosphere. Even though it's a third-person over-the-shoulder view, there are plenty of sections that genuinely feel spooky to walk through because of the amazing design behind the corridors and rooms. The inventory menu was changed from Resident Evil 7's to feel more like the original, so it would pause the game upon opening, while still allowing you to see what's in front of you. Or, well, at least what's on camera. This gives players a chance to recover from the more punishing enemies in the game, plan out their next move, and allow for some tactical approaches to areas and fights. This game also carries over something that we saw in the original remake from 2002, defensive weapons, or sub-weapons. These come in the form of knives, flashbangs, and hand grenades. Now, it's a bit different because they can be used on their own, and you don't even have to equip them in the menu to use them, as there was a quick swap mechanic added. They can also be used to avoid damage when you've been grabbed by an enemy, much like the original use of them. I do think this opened up a can of worms for PC players, as the knife is completely broken. but it is a nice addition to the game when used for its intended purpose. Another thing to help against enemies was the new buff of combining red and blue herbs. This gives you a slight defensive boost, allowing you to take more damage before dying. Very helpful on hardcore, and especially helpful when dealing with the newest enemy, Geodolts. The Geodolt in the original was actually a boss fight, but I suppose they took that design and turned it into a common enemy that you would encounter in the sewers. But yeah, I don't really want to talk about the Geodolts. I mean, I hate these things. I don't want to talk about them. I hate their hitboxes, they're big and dumb, and yeah, whatever. Anyways, difficulty adjustment. A hidden mechanic that makes the game slightly easier if you're playing badly, or makes the game slightly harder if you're playing well. This is actually an old hidden mechanic that was introduced back with Resident Evil 4, but I didn't really touch on it much with that title beforehand. This title is a bit weirder with the DA, and doesn't work like RE4's. It's extremely easy to raise your DA as opposed to lowering it. Lowering it requires you to take damage or to die. Raising it requires you to pick up ammo, sub-weapons, healing items, shoot enemies, kill enemies, and just be playing well in general. It's a broken system that leads to a lot of players feeling like they're accomplishing a lot. But then they get stuck on a difficult boss that's doing massive damage. So they die a bunch in order to beat the boss, because that's just kind of how boss fights go. You die and it's trial and error until you beat it. But the reality of it is that the game is lowering the DA, and it's making it so that the boss dies faster. So really, it's like a fake accomplishment in a way, and I'm not a huge fan of it. The only reason I'm bringing up DA now and not before in RE4 is because in RE4, I mean, it's there, but it's so much worse in this game. It's very broken. But anyways, puzzles! The puzzles were changed slightly, but they still felt a lot like how a classic Resident Evil puzzle would feel, just slightly easier. Probably didn't want to make them as difficult for the sake of modernizing and trying to appeal to a lot of new players. Which brings me to my next point, saving your game. A lot of newer players who probably weren't introduced to the Resident Evil games beforehand don't really know what the ink ribbon system was. Obviously, the ink ribbons were a huge part of the classic formula, and they do make a return here, but they've been altered to only be used sparingly on the hardcore difficulty. Assisted and normal difficulties, there are no ink ribbons, and saving your game isn't even really needed sometimes with how many checkpoints there are, because yes, this game has a checkpoint system. Despite how easy the game can become with this system, they did add an S+ rank for people who wanted to challenge themselves to not save too often, and complete the game in under 3.5 hours. On hardcore, it's 2.5, and on the B scenarios, well, whatever time it was on the A scenario, you would cut that time down by an hour. Which brings me to my next point, B scenarios. This is, without a doubt, the most disappointing thing for older fans in the entire game. I mean, the B scenario feels like an afterthought, and it doesn't even feel like it's truly a B scenario. If you've played the original, you know this feeling all too well, and you definitely understand what I'm trying to get at here. If you haven't, feel free to give those original B scenarios a shot, and you'll understand. Apart from the B scenarios, this game does a pretty decent job at staying faithful to the original, and it doesn't do too much reimagining of the scenarios. It even goes out of its way to bring back stuff like Hunk and Tofu in glorious fashion, and even expands upon the Tofu modes with a bunch of different playable Tofu-like characters. In terms of staying faithful, I'd say it's split down the middle. It's half reimagining, half remake. And I think that's perfectly fine for how quality of a game we got out of RE2 Remake. I mean, it's truly one of the best Resident Evil games for old and new fans alike, and its massive success led to a ton of sales, a ton of praise, and even awards. When Hirabayashi said, "We do it," he was right. I mean, they really did it. Bravo. I wonder if they'll remake 3 next. Man, that'd be insane. Wait, what? barely any time passed before the announcement of Resident Evil 3 Remake, and it was safe to say that everyone was shocked. The fact that RE2 hadn't even been out for a year and RE3 Remake was on its way? I mean, that just sounds too good to be true. Well, it turns out that it was in development for quite some time before RE2 Remake even released, with the help of external companies M2 and Redworks, the latter being used to create the multiplayer mode Resistance. Producers Masachika Kawata and Peter Fabiano worked to recreate Resident Evil 3 in a way that honored the original's more action-packed, thrilling experience. Much like RE2 Remake, they changed the designs of the characters, rewrote dialogue and interactions, and got a team of top-notch voice actors. This game being created alongside RE2 Remake is the answer to a lot of questions that may arise when playing this game. The menu is practically the same, but just slightly redesigned. It allows players to pick up an item once, view the item in the menu upon pickup, and then you never have to see the item pickup in the menu again. It just goes straight to your inventory, which is actually quite nice. The combat is almost the same as well, but brings back the classic dodge mechanic from the original game. This time with a cool visual effect upon performing what we call a perfect dodge. This is when you dodge an enemy at the perfect time while they are in the middle of their attack animation. There's also a regular dodge button that allows you to maneuver around enemies if performed correctly. As well as the dodging, there's also a mechanic added for the grenade launcher, where you can quick swap the ammo type outside of the inventory menu, which is also a welcome addition. Most of the returning enemies have been altered heavily, including the Drain Deimos, the Hunter Gammas, and even Nemesis. The latter being one of the highest offenses of this remake. Nemesis is a complete wuss in this game, and most of the encounters with him are scripted, completely unlike the original and totally misses the point of the game entirely. I mean, it's Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. You shouldn't be able to kill Nemesis so easily every time you see him, and most of your interactions with him shouldn't be scripted events that involved you just simply running forward. In the original, there were plenty of Nemesis encounters where he would follow you around area by area, trying to hunt you down and kill you. And then you'd have to waste almost all of your ammo, or run for your life until you reached a safe room, or progress the game a bit. In the remake, your first encounter with him is at the very start of the game at Jill's apartment, and it's just a scripted hold forward button event that completely eliminates any build-up to you encountering him, like there was in the original. Not only that, but most of this game is reimagined and completely unfaithful to the original. I don't know what happened behind the scenes to cause this game to be such a bad remake, but it's only so upsetting because of the fact that it's actually a really good game. It has a good balance of classic Resident Evil vibes and action game vibes. It has great visuals, the voice acting and dialogue are great, and the reimagined scenarios aren't even that bad. It's just the lack of the original content that is inexcusable. Raccoon City is dumbed down to just a few simple streets. There's no gas station, there's no park, there's no clock tower. Carlos goes to the RPD for whatever reason. Nemesis turns into a Dark Souls boss instead of his original designs, and most of the events between Jill and Carlos are removed. There's no decision-making to differentiate playthroughs, and the puzzles are practically non-existent. There's so much missing here, and there's a bunch of stuff that's just completely altered into something new. Despite all of what I've just said, a good percentage of players are happy with the game, and they don't mind it being so different. In my experience, fans of the original are mostly very upset with this, including myself. It seems like it's a bit divisive, but I personally feel this is almost objectively the worst of the 3 Resident Evil remakes when it comes to it being an actual remake. It's a reimagining, and it's pretty plain to see, but I'll go ahead and stop there, because I don't really want this video to end on a sour rant, you know? Hey, maybe the mixed reception will result in what happened with Resident Evil 6. Capcom will rethink and reform in order to avoid stuff like this in the future, while keeping of the quality of the production, as that was clearly still very, very good. Best of luck to whoever is in charge of the next possible remake in the series. Not saying there is one. And also, best of luck to the team behind Resident Evil Village. I truly hope that all of us can come together and enjoy everything Village has to offer. I think we're a very lucky fan base, being able to see the series continue to live on. It may come to an end sooner than we think, so every new title should be embraced, for better or for worse. But more importantly, I think we're all very thankful to the people who are responsible for making this series what it is, and I'm very thankful for all of you for continuing to support it, and creators like myself who are passionate about it. Thank you for making it this far in the video. I know it was a long one, but this is my first attempt at an original YouTube video, and I felt like making a little love letter to the evolution of one of my favorite series. And with that, I would ask that everybody who did make it this far to please just do me a huge favor, subscribe, give this video a like, share it with some of your friends who are also passionate about Resident Evil, and comment something you may have enjoyed or learned from the video. I also stream full-time on Twitch at twitch.tv/maxilobes. I speedrun a lot of games and have world records for quite a few of them, including Fear, Devil May Cry, Visage, and many more. All of those videos are also on this channel. Finally, I want to give a huge shout out to Demonic Robots for helping me so much with this video and editing the whole thing for me, as well as Survival Horror Network for allowing me to use some of their footage for the video. Loved by many, and praised for being the game responsible for popularizing an entirely new subgenre of video games, survival horror. It undergoes constant evolution and continues to expand farther than anyone could have imagined. Resident Evil is one of the greatest horror franchises to ever exist. May we always cherish its memorable moments, its influence, and its legacy. Much love, and thank you for watching.